Okay, good morning. I'm Scott Forsino from Real Brokerage and Associate Broker. I have the kickoff to our Buyer Agent Compensation Certification Program today with Jay Macklin of Platinum Living Realty from Scottsdale, Arizona, Victoria Rivadeneira, as well, a real estate professional, long time. And we will begin our education and certification platform with Jay instructing us on the needs and the ability to receive compensation for buyer agent representation.
So Jay, I want to thank you for bringing this to the forefront here and educating anyone who wants to learn all about this. There has been so many changes in our industry lately, and I'd like to begin with defining what real estate commissions are and how they actually work with the client.
Yeah, so appreciate you guys bringing me on here too. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people just end up never talking about. So I think the conversation of commissions is super important. I feel like a lot of real estate agents live in the world of industry norms and standards and don't realize how compensation works because nobody talks about it. So this certification program really is about helping identify the holes in the system and how we can actually help agents become better at setting, collecting, and negotiating their fee. So ultimately, that's what the whole certification is about. But commissions obviously are, as you guys know, they are a payment fee of a service that's provided by a real estate agent, whether it's a listing agent or a buyer's agent. And I think there's a lot of different ways agents can collect fees. People don't realize that there's different models of compensation that agents can decide to choose from. But one thing that's just glaring out there is that a lot of people just don't talk about it. The schools don't talk about it. The brokers don't talk about it. So ultimately, the agents just don't understand it. And that's the issue with commissions, is that you really have to understand how commissions are paid, who pays them, the flow of money, and how that flow of money in a transaction works, because you're going to have to articulate that to your client and get them to understand that as well. And so that's kind of why we're here, obviously, with everything that's going on in the nation and the lawsuits and everything, which you guys have talked about in the past. We have to be better at identifying what those are. And a lot of agents don't really know what they are. They know that they get either a percentage of the sales price, whether it's a buyer agent or a listing agent, but there are multiple different ways to collect compensation, whether it's an upfront fee, whether it's a retainer, or a combination of both. And as a listing agent, you could do a net listing, you could do a flat rate. So it doesn't matter how your fee structure is. We're not here to tell you that. We're not here to dictate any of that. We're here to tell you that if you want a certain fee, you're going to have to learn how to set, collect, and negotiate it. And you're going to have that explanation of what commission is to a client and who ultimately pays that fee. And that's the biggest issue that we find, is that most agents don't know who pays that fee.
Right. And you mentioned a couple of things there that from state to state, they vary. So as we go into different types of commissions and the commission structures, I think we should also let everyone know that they do need to check with their state to
Correct.
make sure that they are in compliance with whatever the state sets forth. You mentioned some of the traditional percentage-based commissions. And I think most of us are familiar with that. And I think many agents do know how that works, as well as clients. But there's other things that you mentioned, like flat fees and other sort of hybrid models. Can you go into a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, so I live in what I call the petri dish of different models within the real estate community here in Arizona. We tend to be the bucket of, let's see if it works, and if it works in Metro Phoenix area, it'll work anywhere. So we see a lot of them, but we get a lot of the people who are flat rates, where they do a flat rate fee, just a dollar amount to list a house, and or just a small dollar amount to represent as a buyer, or doesn't have to be small, but just a dollar flat rate amount to represent a buyer. So if I'm a buyer's agent and I go out and I find a buyer, I can just say, hey, my fee is, I'm going to use $100, just as an example. My fee is $100 flat, right? So that's my fee, and we have a lot of those. You see a lot more of those on the listing side, though, than you do the buyer side. I think that might change, but I do think that you're seeing more and more of those flat rate fees. And when I was talking about net listings, a net listing is just the same way as a net buyer. So, for instance, if I have a buyer who wants to buy a property, and I might say something like, every $10,000 in reduction that I give you, we split it. right? That's my fee. So there's a lot of people who do that here too. So it's based on performance-based compensation. There's percentages. It's a percentage of the sales price. Obviously, that's the very traditional one we all know about. But when it comes to sellers or listings, there can be, a number of different ways. And of course, every state's a little different. Some states don't allow net listings. You have to figure that out. But there's also variable listing or variable commissions as well, which a lot of people don't understand how that works. And a variable commission basically is a listing agent saying to a buyer's agent that if I bring the buyer, my seller and I have agreed to reduce the commission. So it's advantageous for the seller to have me represent the buyer as well as the seller. And that's called a variable commission. So I don't know if a lot of states have that. Here in Arizona, we have that. So
Hey, Jay, I have a question.
Things that you have to check with the state, because dual agency would come into play when you're working with both, or if you have to, move over to a transactional type of transaction, you can do that as well, and then eliminate agency altogether.
Correct.
I do want to go into some of the detail of what you're talking about when it comes to some of these different types of models with commission. You mentioned, let's start with the very first one I think you mentioned, which was a flat fee. What would be the benefit to that, and how would that work in detail?
Well, you mean as a buyer's agent?
Both as a selling agent and then also again as a buyer agent, because I think we're going to see these same structures now come into play on the buyer side.
Yeah, I think right now a lot of agents try to get into the flat rate market, and they use that for volume, right? So what the pitch is that, hey, I'm going to charge you a lot less money than what other agents will charge you, but I'll give you the same service.
We're talking about a listing right now.
We're talking about a seller. Yeah, we're talking about a selling agent. So if I'm going after a seller, if I'm going after a listing, and I want to say, hey, my fee is only, and I market that, right? I market my unique selling proposition, my value proposition is the fact that I only charge X amount of dollars to list a property. Had this conversation yesterday with an agent, and he was bringing this up, and I said, is that a concern of sellers? And so a lot of those models don't work very well, because the biggest issue with a seller is not necessarily what they're paying their agent. It's the value they get for paying their agent. And so it's not necessarily about the money, it's about the value. But you could go in and just do like a flat rate. I charge, for instance, I'm just going to say a number, $1,000 for every listing that I take. And the benefit for the agent is you're going to do volume, or the hopes that you'll do volume. And that's where typically it falls down. I'm not a big fan of that model personally, just because I've never seen it work really, really well. But doesn't mean you can't do it. Every agent tries.
I'm going to stop you there, because again, if you're saying I do this for $1,000, would you recommend, and I'm sure that you would, but I really want to go into detail, because there are agents that are taking notes right now and leaning toward what you're saying in this particular model, if it works for them. So if you're saying, let's use that $1,000 as the example, would you break it down? This is what you get for $1,000. This is, $200. This is another $200. This I charge $300. And bring it all the way down to the $1,000 number. And then if you want anything above and beyond, there's a menu that they can choose from, or how would you structure that?
Yeah, so you're right. There are a lot of flat rate companies or agents who do that as a menu. For $1,000, you get this. For $500, you get this. For $200, or whichever way they go. But that could be simply just putting it in the MLS. And then all offers and all the correspondent goes back to the client. We see a lot of those where the seller has to pretty much do all the work, but they're only paying for the MLS access, or they're paying for the forms. And so, it doesn't mitigate it doesn't change or mitigate your fiduciary responsibility. So, you got to take that into accommodation or accordance to what you're doing. And obviously you got to check with your broker to make sure it's okay with them that you're doing that. But yeah, so you could have a menu. You could have a menu of, for X amount of dollars, I'll put it in the MLS and I'll do flyers. I'll do photography. I'll do a drone. And then if you want me to negotiate the contract with the buyer agent or the buyer, then it's an extra, $300, $400, $500 to do that. So that is definitely something we've seen. And that's been going on for years. That is nothing new. That is typically something that I think people try to get into, like I said, for volume. But you have to understand that every marketing you do for your client or yourself, every client you try to get, there's got to be a message to medium to market match. And so if the community you're going after doesn't necessarily need that service or need that, then it doesn't make sense. If it's a big need in the community, or if it's a big hole in the seller's options, then yeah, that could be a great way to get compensated.
Hey, Jay, I have a question specifically regarding buyer agent compensation. That seems to be an issue that needs to be discussed and negotiated and put in the contractor agreement between the agent and the broker. I mean, are you open to, and will you establish the practices and the best approaches to ask your broker what they're willing to do? I mean, if it is a menu of services, there must be an agreement between the broker and the agent. What's fair? What's cool? What can happen? How low can I go? I would think there needs to be either an agent specific or a case by case approach where, Jay, if you're the broker owner, as you are, I want to know, what can I offer? Can I go as high as this? Can I go as low as that?
Sure.
Does Mary have a better deal than Sally? That might be the hierarchy going forward. I mean, because how would that work?
About buyer side.
Between the buyer agent compensation representation, okay. What will you offer and what are the reasonable expectations? And that might be more important than other companies touting split, is the freedom to move, which really might be necessary under the new economy.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, obviously the broker's got to be aware of what you're doing. And some brokers, and there's a lot of brokerages out there that do regulate or don't allow agents to either charge more or less than what they want or what they regulate. And that's broker specific. And so there's brokerages here that won't allow a buyer, a listing agent, a selling agent to offer lower than a certain percentage or dollar amount to a buyer agent on a listing because they don't want it to feel like they look like a discount broker. So, but yeah, absolutely. The broker still has to be able to identify that the agent is going to do this in their business. And so that's why we say check with your broker, because some brokers don't allow that.
Do you think, I mean, based on that, I mean, you said the D word, based on no more collaboration, I'm saying cooperation policy where it's understood, if setting a commission is taboo, what could possibly be a discount broker anymore if we're all set to, there is no standard. So how could there be a discount?
Yeah, I think the discount broker term, is really, in my world, it's discount service. It has nothing to do with fee. It has nothing to do with money. A discount broker is somebody who's just going to a limited representation broker, which is what I talked about earlier, right? I'm going to put it in the MLS. You're going to negotiate everything. That's what I consider a discount broker. But I think the fear of a lot of brokerages out there is that if you don't offer, and to your point, it's going to change. How is that going to work with brokers out there who don't allow their agents? They're going to have to change their policies. Don't allow their agents to offer a certain percentage to the buyer's agent as a listing agent or selling agent. It'll be quite interesting to see how this works out, but I think we have a good solution for that.
Okay, so I want to talk more about the different structures. So I want to move over to maybe an hourly rate or a variable rate, like you said earlier, and how would that work on the buyer side as well as on the listing side?
Yeah, great question. I think that, ultimately, if you look at the structure of how commissions work, right? The seller is compensating the selling agent as a percentage of the purchase price of the property, which incentivizes the listing agent to get the highest price. But as you look at it from a buyer perspective, it's still the same percentage that the buyer agent is getting, but the incentive is reversed, right? The incentive for the buyer agent is reversed, meaning you're more incentivized to get the buyer a higher price. Well, that's ultimately not your fiduciary responsibility. Your fiduciary, unless the buyer tells you that, which I don't know anybody who's ever would, but ultimately you're incentivized to make the buyer pay a higher price. So going to an hourly rate could be something that we go to. It could be a flat fee structure of price point, right? So I was doing brainstorming on this with some other friends of mine, and for instance, let's say it's between $300,000 and $400,000 house. And so $500 or $5,000 flat commission plus your hourly rate. So that could be an option. That could be something
when you say a $5,000, and I know we're just using a number, this is buyer agent to the buyer, which is the client to the buyer agent.
Correct.
And then they would have a contract that says my minimum fee is $5,000.
Yep.
And then any additional time that I put into this to negotiate, to advise, to do any of the things that are on our guideline sheet, it would be calculated on an hourly rate at X
Correct.
amount.
Correct. Yep. So that certainly could, and if you think about it, it incentivizes the buyer agent. Well, again, somebody said, well, it actually incentivizes the buyer agent to work in less speediest manner, right? Because the more hours that are racked up, the more they get charged. So, that's more of the attorney lawyer type compensation, right? The hourly rate, billable.
But
rate.
Jay, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know. I mean, with that realtors would ever accept that type of role or responsibility as an attorney. You have even your operating account. There's a fiduciary responsibility to cut some expenses, and I've heard myself and I've given, listen, let's not spend your money.
Yep.
They're actually the custodian of your money. So that might, as you say, bring up a lot of ethical issues. I don't know that, I think there is no ethical rules system because this has never been done. I mean, brokers have never held money, although for down payments, that's more escrow. They've never held any operating expenses and had any responsibility to account for those funds.
Yeah. Yep.
And that will change.
Yeah, that could change. And as a broker owner, we do, right? Well, obviously you have a trust account, you have an operating account. So I think agents will, that may change.
But in a lot of states, like in New York, there's no such thing as a broker trust account.
Got it. Yeah. A lot of states are.
Depends on the state again. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. So in Arizona, we don't use attorneys. We write contracts just like, attorney does, but a lot of states, you're right. They have to go through an attorney. They have to go through, they don't use title or escrow. And some states are both. Sometimes some states like California are dual, right? There's a different escrow company, a different title company. Here we use title and escrow all in one. So you just got to check with your state. But the compensation itself isn't going to change. It's going to decide. You guys are going to decide on, or agents will decide on how they want to get compensated. And if it just becomes like we may think it's going to, a buyer will have to pay a buyer agent, a seller will have to pay a selling agent. The question is, how do I get my fee? Like, what's the best structure for me? What's the best model that I'm going to use to go get it? Am I just going to do the same percentage of the sales price that was offered, industry norm and standard for the last 40 years? Or will I change something else and just go to a flat rate? It'll be interesting to see what a lot of agents do.
And I think it will also depend on the client. Maybe the client
Agreed.
will also have some input in this and say, I prefer this over that. How would you work that out with me? So I think everyone has to really understand the different structures. I know that we're a little bit over time, and I want to go into the variable structure that you talked about before we end this, because this is so valuable, what you're teaching. So can you explain that?
Yeah, so a variable commission, at least here in Arizona, is set up to where if a listing agent would take, or selling agent takes a listing or a sale, they have to disclose to the buyer agent that it's variable, meaning that they understand that if the listing agent has a buyer for that property, the listing agent and the seller have negotiated a reduced commission that the listing agent would take should he or she represent the buyer as well. Dual agency, limited representation. Again, some states don't allow that, but that is a variable commission. But you could also do that in reverse on a buyer. You could also say, hey, my compensation is 100% driven on performance. Now that's very tough in a multiple offer situation. You're paying more, you're overpaying for a property, or you're competing with 5 other buyers. But I've heard people do this in the past where they would take a percentage of the discount or a portion of the discount that they would offer the buyer. So, hey, if you're looking for a $500,000 property, if I get you $10,000 off, we split the balance, or we split that up to a certain amount for my compensation. Mm-hmm. So that it's more performance based. And again,
when you're working with contracts with buyer agents, buyer agent contracts and representation, and talking about this commission. In the past, usually we stuck with listings that were in MLS, and it was very difficult to actually work something out with the for sale by owner. And sometimes the buyer would go directly to the for sale by owner, but that would be eliminated now. With a buyer contract, you'd also be showing for sale by owners. Is that correct?
Yes. So that's one of the big value propositions that I don't think a lot of real estate agents understand how to present to their buyers, is that with a buyer agency, and agents used to say, well, I know what's in it for me, but what's in it for the buyer to sign an agreement? Well, it's because they get to see everything. They get to see homes that are not even on the MLS, not even listed for sale, right? So nothing stops me from going out, understanding what the buyer needs, going to find that property, reaching out to that seller in some way, whether it's a FSBO or not even on the market for sale by owner. Yeah. And having that conversation. And so, if every agent is simply just sending MLS listings to a buyer, it becomes less and less valuable for that buyer agent to collect a fee. So we have to do a little better of a job of identifying, what do I get if I sign a buyer contract? And the answer is going to be that I'm going to find you the house regardless if it's on the MLS or not. I can approach any person. There's 1.4 million homes here in Metro Phoenix. I can go approach any one of these properties, may not get them to want to sell, but if I tell them, hey, I've got a buyer who's looking for your exact property, I would venture to guess if I knocked on enough doors or called enough people, I'd probably get somebody who's interested in selling.
And I want to make a quick question and a point. Let me jump in on that because I have a few issues on that. That to me will really restore the true role of a broker. If anything, make it much, 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 much more valuable. Look at one or two of these scenarios. Right now, within the clear cooperation policy, a property is on MLS. Everyone has access to it. It's even worse because there's Zillow leads that bring you directly to a property that an agent didn't even know about. Mm-hmm. But in your case, if you're hired, this is in the scenario you're setting. It should be that if you're hiring me, you're going to get so much more. You'll actually ferret out properties, which no one does anymore. No one needs to. So in that case, there are so many more obstacles. They'd be speaking to a for sale by owner. There is no broker has any professional connection. You're dealing with basically a wild card because you don't know if that for sale by owner is going to sell to their cousin next week and entertain your offer. So you're dealing with many, many more factors. In addition, if that, Victoria will laugh, if you hire a broker that's not a realtor, they're just a licensee in their state, there's nothing that stops that broker you hire to knock on the door of a listed property. They don't have a duty to stay away.
Correct. That's only part of NAR.
Right. So there's a lot of value to hiring someone to perform the full task. And on top of that value, one of the key indicia of finding the clear cooperation policy violative of antitrust Sherman Act was that the realtors don't any longer conduct all the services they did in the past. Technologies replace them as far as the search function and the role. However, the compensation did not go down. That's not me, that's the court speaking. One of the main, indications was that a role has been eliminated, yet they made the same money. So now in this case, I think an agent would be far freer and far legitimate in demanding compensation for their role.
Yep. Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree.
Because now you're paying for skill.
Yep.
And they're going out and trying to find something. So we're talking about houses that may have been listed in MLS, but also houses that are for sale by owner. But what about the homeowner that isn't even considering selling today, but it's a thought maybe down the road, and now the agent brings forward this buyer? That's why I brought this up with the variable, because at that point, that's really where this would fit in. Is that right?
Yeah, and we do that a lot. We have a lot of agents here who will do that because of our lack of inventory. And I think, Scott, to your point, I think, and to your point too as well, is that the skill it takes to do that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Manhattan in New York, they don't have an MLS system, correct?
No, they do not.
Yeah, so if you get a listing, you literally have to schlep that to buyer agents, and you've got to do buyer broker or broker tours, and you've got to truly market that house. And so as a buyer agent, I would assume in New York, you have the same issue, right? You've got to go out and say, hey, I've got a buyer who's looking for this property. It's going to take me a lot more time, energy, and effort and skill to be able to find that property, as opposed to just jumping on the MLS and going, oh, there it is, and I'll send it to them. So
there's even more skill required in a New York setting because there's no obligation to co-broke. You have to ask to co-broke. So a listing is designed to be sold in-house. Okay. So you'd have to actually almost intervene and request to be involved for co-broking. It's not always a yes.
Yeah, similar to commercial.
You're right. So you're now getting into a whole level that, think about this, to show a property is on MLS is a realtor's divine birthright. Now it's a skill that has to be implemented.
Developed. Yeah, agreed. Well, and that's one of the things that we've focused heavily on when we get our buyer broker agreements, our loyalty agreements, is that the benefit to the buyer is that we're going to show them everything that's on the MLS. That's our first line of defense. We always say that. But ultimately, we're going to find houses that are pocket listings that people, whether it's for sale by owner or people don't necessarily have an agent, but they're willing to sell. That takes a skill and a really good marketing system to be able to weed those people out or get them to raise their hand and identify. And so ultimately, as a buyer, that's what I want from a buyer agent, right? So
right.
I want my buyer agent to work as hard as he or she can to find me the perfect house. And I don't want to compete with 5 other buyers. I want you to help me beat out 5 buyers to the hot new listings or the hot properties that are available for sale.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Jay, I think that you have brought a tremendous amount of value to us all understanding the different types of commission structures there are and why the buyer agency agreement and that representation is actually a good thing. Because I think this is going in a very positive direction. So I want to thank you for that. Scott, do you have anything else to add to this before we end this?
I think, yes, the buyer agency agreement creates a real obligation, and people use the word loyalty. And I believe that's a personal trait. What really looking for is liability, which is responsibility for payment. Mm-hmm. And so it's an interesting conundrum that on the seller side, people understand they pick up a pen, they're responsible for payment. But on the buyer side, I've heard it said that they have an agent for each community. And it makes it really hard to represent that person because it's a two-way street and they know that there's nothing to gain. So I think that as Victoria said, getting a firm agreement and an obligation and liability for a certain sum really would bind someone and offer the agent a higher opportunity to really serve that client and be paid commensurately.